Hello, everyone. So thankful that you've joined us for our November webinar. Hard to believe that it is November already. I'm here with a couple of great leaders. First of all, we have Grant Bowman, who's with us. He works for our Destiny team, and he's actually our alumni director, he and his wife, Kelly. And so if as you graduate DLI, you'll hear a lot from Grant and Kelly about keeping you plugged in, part of our family, and he's fantastic here, and he's really here to run tech support and be the man behind the scene, but he's also a very, very wise, seasoned leader, so we may just pull him in, and it'll be good because he's not prepared at all, which means that what he'll say comes right from his heart because we've not had time to prepare. On the other hand, Pastor Jonathan Perry, he's written everything out. He knows exactly what he's going to say. But also Pastor Jonathan with us, who this is his third time here on the webinar, and every time he's delighted us, and just such a wise man, and a lot of experience and very seasoned. So we're just very glad that, and I don't use seasoned because you're older, Pastor Jonathan, just by the way.
Okay. I started young.
Word, but I mean, but anyways, we're having a great night. Pastor Jonathan, you want to just say some greetings, some introductory comments, and before we dive into our topic here?
Yeah, it's always great to be a part of the Destiny program and all the stuff that's happening. Of course, I was able to be a part of a couple of the Connect meetings, one in Akron and one in Owensboro, Kentucky. And so, yeah, it was fun being there. And I'm just thrilled to be back here with the webinar and with all of our students from DLI.
Why don't you give us a little refresher, your church, your ministry?
Yeah. So I've been in full-time ministry since I was 19. I'm 56, which comes out to about 36, 37 years. And so my wife and I, for 10 years, for the first 10 years, we did evangelism, like itinerant ministry. And so we traveled all over the world. And then for the last 27 years, we've been here in Toledo, Ohio. And we pastor, we're the lead pastors of Life Chapel. And then we have a pastoral team that works with us. We are also the entrepreneurs of Rust Belt Coffee, which is a great coffee shop that is a church that doesn't look and feel and sound like a church. So it's just a point of influence, really, is what Rust Belt is. And yeah, so we work on a number of boards and foundations and ministries to just help move the kingdom forward. So that's our number one agenda, is always to move the kingdom forward.
Awesome. And you kind of segue now into our topic, and that is that you've done a lot of different things in ministry. You're doing a lot of different things concurrently in ministry. I think that's something where a trend we're seeing is that more and more pastors are bivocational, not necessarily because they have to make ends meet or whatsoever, but because our calling often takes us into different avenues and venues at the same time, whereas, so it's not like you were a pastor, then you started a coffee shop. There's an ability to do both because your calling really has equipped you to wear both hats. So tonight what we're going to talk about is what will be most of our students' least favorite topic. That is change, because I've heard Dr. Brassel say several times that 70% of people perceive change to be a loss followed by grief and agony. Like 70% people consider change to be a loss followed by pain, anguish, grief, agony. And then as leaders, often we are change agents. That's what God has called us to do. So we'll get up on a Sunday and say, oh, a big change is coming. Isn't this the best thing ever? And for us, it's the best thing ever. But for everyone else sitting in the seats, they're going, oh God, no. Like, what are you going to change? What are you going to change? But change is an inevitable part of life, ministry. You'll hear people say things like, we just need to go back to the old style. We need to go back to how the church originally was. But the church has been an organization and a people in flux, in transition from this very beginning. So an example I will sometimes allude to is that if you read Paul's earlier letters, like Corinthians, the letters he writes first, usually his idea of leadership in the church is very charismatic, in the sense of whoever is gifted should be the one that's leading. If you're gifted as a pastor, if you're gifted as a teacher, if you're gifted in a ministry with some kind of spiritual gift, a psalmist or a song, you should exercise those gifts. And not that he contradicts himself, but as his understanding changes, by the time you get to 1st and 2nd Timothy, you're reading about elders and pastors and deacons and overseers. And there seems to be there's a structure for who can fill those roles and who can't fill those roles and qualifications. And so not that Paul's theology changes, but he goes from like, okay, if God's giving you a gift, use it, to, okay, let's put some strictures on what that means, because the church was changing all throughout the New Testament era. You see this in the life of Paul. Paul underwent many changes in his ministry. So Paul and Barnabas were, serving it really in a pastoral type role in Antioch. They're teaching pastors. They're there, and then God sets them apart as missionaries. And so they switch from like this pastoral teaching role to a missionary role. And then as they're together, they have a disagreement, which leads to them separating and going different ways. But it was another substantial change. So they were a team, and now they're now functioning somewhat individually on their own. They come back to Antioch, and so Paul's ministry now as a missionary, he's been traveling, going to all the churches, and then he tells this church he upstarted in Ephesus, he tells them, God is sending me to Jerusalem, and I'm going to go to Jerusalem now. And they said, no, you can't go to Jerusalem. They're going to bind you up. They're going to kill you, because they were saying, we're not ready for this type of change. You're our pastor. You're a person that we count on. And he said, no, God is calling me somewhere different. And we can look at many examples throughout that, but to realize that Paul's role throughout the book of Acts changed. And all of us will see changes in leadership, changes in responsibility. God will call us to some ministries and then call us away from those ministries. God will give us a gift that we use for a season, but then we transition to something different a little bit later on. Inevitably, in life and in leadership, you will change. You will be in flux. The Spirit is compared throughout the Scripture as a wind, and it blows where it will. And so those of us who are led by the Spirit and are filled with the Spirit, there's this kind of unpredictable thing that you never know what God's going to do, what doors he's going to open. I see both of you gentlemen nodding, because you're doing things, or you have done things in your life and your ministry that you would have never imagined that you would be doing, but the wind blew that way. So we don't want to become these rigid, unchangeable, I shall not be moved type Christians. We used to sing the old hymn, I shall not be moved, and some people meant it quite literally. Like, no, I will not be moved on this issue, on this doctrine. I will not be moved on my philosophy. So we can't put up this stoic, rigid, I'm not moving, I'm not changing. It can't happen. But at the same time, we can change. We can exit roles. We can switch from one thing to the other in a way that glorifies God and uplifts other people. So just because change is inevitable, but how we process change, all that is up to us. We get a choice in that process of how to oversee these changes in our lives. You can jump in here, Pastor Jonathan, if you'd like.
Well, yeah, I think this is where you come into the idea of what is an opportunity and what is an assignment over your life. So you're right. After 37 years of ministry, I've been through a lot of change and highs and lows, and connected to certain people at certain times, then disconnecting for different various reasons. And one of the things as I get older that I've had to really start to challenge myself on is this an opportunity or is this an assignment? So when I was younger, I would chase after every opportunity because I just wanted to do the will of God. Right. I mean, if you called me to preach, man, I'd drive, all day long to get there to preach and hope to get enough gas money to get back home because I just wanted an opportunity. You know what I'm saying? I was just getting started. And even as pastoring, when I started pastoring, different opportunities and ministries would arise, and connections with ministerial alliances and things like that would arise. And I'd be jumping on every opportunity. But the older I get, the more I realize God has a very defined calling on people's lives. And with that defined calling comes an assignment. Right. And that assignment will change from time to time. And so what I do now is I don't ask myself, is this an opportunity? Because if it's an opportunity, I don't really have time for it. I only have time for the assignment at this season of my life. And I lean heavy into it, knowing that that assignment may change and shift. It may broaden at other times. It may narrow in and become more focused. But I'm asking myself, what is my assignment in this season? And that's really what I lean into. So right. That's to me, that's the thing that you have to start to differentiate in when you really get serious about ministry. Is this as an opportunity or an assignment?
That's brilliant. And I think that gets us into our, if we concede that change is inevitable, mm-hmm. and that ministry roles are going to shift, and ministry roles are going to, but so we're people of the Spirit, led by the Spirit, following the Spirit. And we begin to ask ourselves, well, then how do we change in a way, transition roles where we were in kids ministry, but now we're feeling a heart towards youth. Inevitably, there'll be a season where you are in a church and for whatever reason, you feel like you can't stay there anymore and you need to go somewhere else. Or so how do we mitigate those risks? Like, how do we mitigate the risk? And the first one, as you said, I believe, is to differentiate between an opportunity and an assignment. And that just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do something.
Exactly.
And there are too many of us that seem to always be looking for the next open door. So we're never really truly invested where we are because we're thinking about where we could be or where we're going to be. Mm-hmm. We're never saying, okay, well, this is where God has me. This is my assignment. I'm going to do all that I can, because we're waiting for the door to open, the promotion to happen, the title to be given, to be able to transition from, a volunteer leader to a paid staff member. So we're always looking for that next opportunity. And while doing that, we're going to miss the assignment that we have. And then I'm passionate about this, as you might can tell, because we have to remember God's people, they're not just pawns in your ministry career. They're not just, God, if you are a leader, he has entrusted you. He has entrusted people to you. And if you're viewing them as opportunities and not as assignments, God doesn't, he's pretty clear about how he differentiates between a shepherd and a hired hand. He doesn't really care much for the hired hand. He's all about the shepherd. And so if it's just like, well, I'm at this church or I'm at this position, but I'm just using this position. I'm going to throw an example, but I'm just going to do kids ministry. And I don't really care anything about the kids, but I just want the pastor to see me doing it so that he'll let me do youth. And then I'm going to do youth, and I don't really care anything about these teenagers. But if I do youth, then one day he'll see me and promote me to something else. And when we begin to use God's people as opportunities instead of assignments, that's a pretty weighty game that we're playing.
Yeah, totally. And so the way that my wife and I try to lead is with open hands. So we understand that God has put us in a position to steward what has been given to us. And so there will be times when people will come into our lives for a reason or for a season. We never try to manipulate them. We don't want to control them. We're not trying to nail them down and say, you never get an option to leave. We just say, while you're here, we want to invest in you. We want to engage with you. We want to love you. We want to serve you. Now, on the flip side of that, what I would ask as a leader is for people not to come with an agenda, not to come, as you said, looking to climb the little ladder, the church corporate ladder, but to be able to say, I am investing myself here. I'm committing myself to walk out my gifts and talents in this ministry. So I know DLI is big on gifts and talents, finding your gifts. What's your spiritual gifts? What's your natural gifts? How do you blend those together? Find those things. Don't just look for anything to do. Although if your pastor needs you to do anything. But don't use that. There's a difference in using positions and serving in a position. And many times it can go both ways. Either the leader will use people for a position, or the person will use a position to get to the leader. Does that make sense? Yeah. So what we have to do is we have to look at this and say, I'm not going to use this position to get closer, as you've already said. I'm going to serve well because this is what my pastor asked me to do. But my ultimate goal is to get to where my gifting is most beneficial to the body.
Right.
How do I get my gifting into a position so that it is most beneficial to the body? And this is where cooperating with a leader, cooperating with your pastor, your team lead, if you're in a larger setting, or if you're in a team lead kind of environment, how do I best serve? And I think serve is the key word that we have to stay focused on in this, or it becomes manipulative, or it becomes twisted some way. So I think it's really important that we stay focused on the idea of assignment and then serving. I love the, what is it? The Destiny Serve. Is that, it's not the hashtag, it's the, is it the hashtag?
Is there
or one of the Instagram. Yeah. Instagram, yeah. So I love that, because what it does is it, Facebook is Destiny Leaders and then Instagram is Destiny Serve. And I'm like, man, that's pretty nifty how somebody thought that up. But I love that, because that's what it's about. It really is. And so when you say you're in Destiny Leadership Institute, you can ultimately say, I'm in Destiny Servant Training.
Right. Absolutely.
So yeah, I think there's something to that.
Yeah, right. So first of all, if you're navigating a change in your life, is this an opportunity or an assignment? That's the first thing. The other thing that I would add here, and it's something that I've said before, I think on a webinar, but one way you can tell the difference between an opportunity and an assignment is, are you following the push or the pull? Because an assignment will pull you to it. An opportunity is often what happens whenever you feel pushed out of your current context. And so if you're looking to make a change or a transition, and it's really based on your frustration in your current context, you're going to be very disappointed when you get there, because you're going to find out that the problem really wasn't where you were. It was probably you. There was at least something in you that you need to learn in that season. But whenever there's a pull, so whenever I came to Grace Church in this role that I'm in now, in addition to what I do with Destiny, the pull was so strong. Like, yes, this is where I want to be. This is where God's calling me to be. And it wasn't because I was fed up in my current context, like I needed to go somewhere. It was because I was being pulled. So if you're asking, how do I differentiate between an opportunity and an assignment, that's usually part of it, that your assignment is something like, man, I've got to do that. Like there's something that resonates in my spirit. There's something that, but an opportunity is often like, okay, well, I don't really care that much about where I am right now. I don't love it, don't hate it, or I'm miserable, whatever it is. But I really just want to get out of doing this to do that. And God will often pull you and not push you. If that, the Spirit draws, the Spirit pulls. That's what He does. It doesn't so much push. So if you're asking yourself how to differentiate between an opportunity and an assignment, that's a really good way. Are you being drawn, or are you feeling pushed? Secondly, you want to just jump in there?
Yeah, because when I look at the transitions of ministry I've been through, so I was an intern in a church in West Virginia way back in the day. Then I felt pulled. One of the things I said I would, early on when I accepted my call to preach, is I'm never going to travel. I'm never going to be an itinerant minister. I'm never going to live out of a suitcase. That's not what God's called me to do. But when God did call me to do that, it was a pull. Right. And then we did that for 10 years. And then we started to feel the pull toward pastoring.
Right.
And every time we shift in ministry, there is that. I love the way you clearly stated that is so good, is it's always a pull and not a push. So I just wanted to just give you my take on that, because I love that.
Awesome. Thank you. Then secondly, so we're looking at opportunity and versus assignment. The second thing I think in a season of change to realize is that gifts and callings seldom change, but iterations of those change. So it's less likely that God's going to call you to do something completely out of character from what you've done before, or completely different than what you're currently doing. So if we go back to Paul, the example we used, so Paul was a teacher and a pastor in Antioch, and then he got called to be a missionary, but he was still teaching and pastoring as a missionary. And it was a teaching and pastoring gift that pulled him to Rome. So he's in prison in Rome, and what's he doing? He's teaching and pastoring people from a jail cell in Rome. That his call never changed. He was never, he was never like Paul, the pastor and teacher one day, and Paul the psalmist and the traveling singer the next day. Who he was changed with him. I've seen this in my own life where I've done itinerant ministry. For a season, I was primarily just leading DLI. For a season, I was assisting in my dad's church. Now for the last 2 years, I've been pastoring here in Houston. But my gifts are the same. I'm still doing basically the same thing. It's just how I'm doing it. Like the form of it, the function hasn't changed, but the form has changed. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking for a good way to remember that, is that God will often change the form, but rarely the function.
Yeah, that is so good. It's almost like at times, and I'm under I kind of live under the idea that we have multiple gifts. Mm-hmm. I don't know of too many people that have solo gifts, right. Nor I don't think I know anybody that has all the gifts, which right. is why we need one another. But what will happen is at different parts of, what's that?
I'm glad we met. You finally met someone.
Yes. Landon Galloway has all the gifts. This is a monumental moment. But what will happen is at certain times, certain gifts will accentuate and other gifts will diminish, depending on the season, depending on the moment, the context. So when you follow the writings and the teachings of Paul, at certain times, he can become very apostolic. Sure. And very, with a heavy authority. And then at other times, he'll that gift will not shut down, but it'll diminish, and the teaching gift will come out when he's writing his letters. Right. He can write some very, passionate letters teaching. So I think that what we have to do is, number one, identify those gifts, and then let those gifts kind of ebb and flow in the season that God has us in, but always keeping our eye on, this is my gifting, right. And I think another thing happens too is I have, and I say this with a little bit of hesitancy, but I have an apostolic gifting in our region. Now, I believe that there are regional apostles, and there's what we would call maybe national apostles and international apostles, and really the apostle is the influencer. That's the key element of an apostle, is to walk in and take authority and take dominion and influence a society or a region or a nation or whatever that is. I've always had that on my life, but it was undeveloped because God was using other things in my life to develop that gifting. And it's only now that I'm 56, and I know for others it comes much earlier. It comes in different ways, and I don't think there's one way God does things. But for me, it's now that I'm in these years that God has given me the freedom to walk out this new gifting that's always been there, just a seed in my heart. I can feel it every once in a while, see it every once in a while, but now it's starting to really broaden. And I think if people won't give up on their giftings, because sometimes people, I think, get stuck with opportunities, they miss an assignment, they give up on the gifting, it's over, it's not going to work, I don't really know how to do this. Just hang in there on that gifting, because it will come through.
Right. Right. So helpful there. So good and true. And what resonated with what you just said with me is that I've primarily have a teaching gift. And so I have other gifts. I do have a pastoral gift. I have an administrative gift, but teaching gift is my strong suit. So wherever I am, I find myself using that gift to teach. And sometimes that's through preaching. Sometimes it's through an outlet like this. But the truth is that for my generation and the way that we came up in ministry, this particular gift was not always the one that was most sought after for people who were going into fivefold ministry. And so there was always a temptation for me to be something that I wasn't, because it looked like a surer track to get to where I wanted to go, which would be, full-time ministry.
Yeah.
Being patient with my gift, now I really feel like every door I have open really is because I've been faithful to that gift. And if I would have been like everyone else, I might not have stood out. But where I am is because I was faithful to that gift. So whatever your gift is, stay faithful to it. What you're doing will often change, but how you're fundamentally gifted rarely does. And that's why we've had some webinars there. And the thing I would just say for a lot of young leaders is that if you're listening, there's a temptation to always be chasing opportunities, as we said earlier, and you who really have no idea what they want to do. And one day they're really fired up about this, and one day they're really fired up about that, and one day, but finding out who you are, how God's formed you, and to go from there. But let's keep going here. I think you alluded to this earlier, but it's so important that in a season where you feel like it's time to exit a role, to do something different, to cooperate with a leader. Leader in the Old Testament, the leaders were often prophets. A season of history where the people were led by people with a prophetic gift. And those prophets, another way to say prophet is a seer. And usually your leader has a prophetic seer gift, and that he can see things, or she can see things that you may not see in yourself. And so being submitted to a seer, being submitted to someone who has an ability to see. So you cooperate. So I feel like a change is coming in this role. What does Dr. Brassfield think about that? Personally, I feel something here. What are my senior pastors, Pastor Scott Jones, Pastor Brett Jones, what do they think about that? Because they often can see things for me and through me that I'm not in a good position to see myself. And that's part of being, bought into their leadership, is allowing them to see. So cooperate with your leader, find out what do they think. And you've had these conversations before, Pastor Jonathan, where there's someone who's feeling a transition and they're nervous to tell you about it, but you have been itching for an opportunity to see them transition into a role that fits them better. And you're hesitant to bring it up, and they're hesitant to bring it up. And so you both stay kind of miserable with each other for a short season because they don't come to you and get you involved.
Yeah. Well, and this just happened right here at Life Chapel. So we had Tim and Nicole McLeod, and I'm sharing their name because you'll understand why. They were on our teaching staff for, my goodness, more than a decade. They've been a part of our leadership team for close to 20 years. And you're right. For the last few months, we were both feeling it. Neither one of us really knowing what to do. But we had such a relationship that I trusted their relationship with God. They trusted my relationship with God. We didn't know it, but we were both praying about the same thing. What's next? So they come to me about 2 months ago and just said, Pastor, here's where we're at. We're not leaving the church. We're not wanting to go down the street and start a church. We're not wanting to do something different. We know we're supposed to stay here, but we don't believe we're supposed to be in that teaching role any longer. And we had a great conversation. Our next step was, okay, how do we create a healthy exit plan so that the church sees a good example of what it means to exit right? Because exiting right is so important, and we'll talk about that later. But this cooperation and working together with them made it, over the period of just a few weeks, they were able to transition out with honor and respect, and I honored them, and we blessed them, and we just heaped on them all kinds of praise, and then they were likewise able to say, Pastor was so gracious, because we've got ministries that we do that now he's going to have to fill, and we're going to have to find new players to come into these different roles. But having that grace to come forward to your leader and say, you know what, I feel a change. Help me with this transition.
Right.
That empowers that pastor or that leader to really help set you up for what's next.
Right.
But you need to get that person on board sooner than later. Yes. Because the worst thing that a pastor hates is for somebody to come in and say, the Lord told me. Well, once you pull the God card, the conversation's over. It's like, what am I going to say? God didn't tell you? Well, I don't have a voice in this conversation. Where when somebody comes and says, I've been praying about something. I need you to walk with me on this journey. Man, that makes the transition so much easier to deal with.
Right.
When there's not that hard, God said.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is, as a leader, I know that is the most difficult thing whenever someone comes to you with a transition in mind. And it's always, well, I've been praying and God said this. And so, I mean, I don't know about you, Pastor Jonathan, but the times where I just had a clear directive from the Lord, where I knew undoubtedly exactly what he wanted me to do next, those have been few and far between for me. But for some people, like, he tells them what to eat for breakfast. He tells them what to wear that day.
Yes.
Like, I don't know, maybe my prayer life is off. Like, maybe you should be pastoring and I shouldn't be. I don't know what. But the thing is, though, is like, to go to your leader with a sense of openness, not already determined what you're going to do. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about how to do that with grace in a moment. But there's this thing where, like, okay, I'm feeling this transition, but because you opened up and gave me the opportunity, and because you've invested in me, mm-hmm. I feel like the transition needs to happen, but we're going to do it on your terms. So
yeah,
help me formulate a plan for this to happen in a way that doesn't hurt you or harm the church. So for now, though, it's just suffice to say, the earlier you can get your leader involved, the better. And that's great. So one thing that can help us here too, another point that I think we should bring up here, is that if you are a leader that is overseeing a team, maybe if you're a pastor, but if you're overseeing a team, one way to help this process of change is to make sure that people are fit for the role that you're giving them, so that you don't have to make a change every 2 weeks. I think we've all done that. I've been guilty where, okay, you are now the leader of this ministry. We're going to give you this title. This is your new area. And then about a month in, you're like, oh, Lord, what did I do? And you're feeling this need to, like, so a good piece of advice for those of us who are leaders of teams is to test people in roles before you give them a title. That way, okay, you come to me, I want you to lead this project for me. And if you do well with that, then that might become your official responsibility role, your official title or whatever. But if I give out titles and say, okay, now you are over this ministry, now you're my number 2, now you're whatever, you're now the assistant to the regional manager or assistant regional manager, whatever your preference is there. Once I give that title out, then I either have to make a change or get stuck in a situation that I'm not happy with. So whenever it's a season of change and you need to appoint a new position, you need to fill in a new, don't just say, okay, now this is the new leader over this. It's like, hey, why don't you lead a small group that does this? Or why don't you help me organize this event? And then through that, let people kind of step into a role rather than giving them a title that makes that change pretty difficult.
Yeah, this is so good. I was just in a meeting with a pastor of a large church, much larger than ours. Maybe not as large as Grace, but still, it was, it would be probably 4,000 or 5,000. And he said that they had actually put in a new youth pastor, but had not yet given him the title. And I said, how's this working? And he said, the former youth pastor is still on staff. He's transitioning out to a new position. So what we did is we brought the new guy in to walk beside the old youth pastor. And the old youth pastor is really not doing the job anymore, but he still has the title. And it gives this guy time to experiment, to work, to figure out, oh, how do I do this? How do I do that? And then eventually the title's placed on him, but they're giving him 6 to 9 months without a title to do all the work so that he can kind of get comfortable in his skin. They can make sure he's the right fit so that if they get him in, like you said, 6 months in, and it's like, oh man, we just made a huge mistake. Because listen, volunteers especially, and if you lead volunteers, please hear what I'm about to say. Volunteers are easy to get in and hard to get out. Yeah. And the reason I say that is you can't just fire somebody. You just can't give them a job review and say, you're not fulfilling. You're talking about church people. What comes after? I had a position. They threw me out. Now we got church hurt, which, that's a whole nother conversation. But when you're bringing volunteers in, you really do have to be careful about, titles and position structure and leadership roles so that there's not misunderstandings, confusion. I thought you said, I didn't know this. So yeah, I think that was great that you brought that in, Landon. I just think was really good.
Yeah, I do. I love what you said about volunteers. Easy to get in, difficult to get out. It's very hard to fire a volunteer without feelings getting hurt. Mm-hmm. And oh, by the way, normally like a volunteer in one area has family and friends that volunteer in other areas. And so it's a mess. So you want to be really careful about who you appoint to those positions. And it's better to act slow than to than quickly there. But that's a great point. So I want to go to our last part of this. We have some questions rolling in. I encourage others to submit questions. I want to give us plenty of time for questions. So we've talked about, when it's time to shift roles, when it's time to make some changes and what we're doing in ministry. Let's talk for a moment about how to exit gracefully. And this might be the most important thing that you learn at DLI. Because we know how to enter well, we do not know how to exit well. We know how to start strong, but finishing strong is difficult. And I can't tell you how many times that we've experienced, both personally and dealing with friends, the pain that comes whenever an exit doesn't happen the right way, whether that's from a ministry, from a church, which let me just say right off the bat, the reasons to leave a church are few. And often whatever reason you're thinking in your head right now is usually not a good reason. The church is a covenant relationship. It's a family. So I don't want you to do anything that we say tonight as a way of like giving you tips on how to go to the church across town. All that you're going to hear us say is submit where you are, serve where you are. If there's a problem where you are, be part of the solution, make it better, plug in. But there will be a time that maybe it's from a ministry or where you just feel like, okay, I need to make an exit. So let's talk about exiting with grace. Exiting with grace. I think the first part is the timing, where you don't jump too quickly. You don't have a frustrating Sunday, right? I mean, we often joke that pastors aren't allowed to make any decisions on Monday because after Sunday, you wake up Monday morning, you go, I don't think I want to do this anymore. I think I could, go sell cars or whatever, something besides this. So don't be too hasty, but also don't drag your feet. If you're feeling frustrated and your spirit's kind of is becoming bitter and your heart's not in anymore, go ahead and talk to your leader after you have some time to process it. But don't jump too quickly and don't drag your feet.
Yeah, so I would totally agree with that. And I think the challenge here is, you stated timing is so critical. And this is where you need to understand, number one, the timing of God. What is the timing of God? What is the timing of the church? What state is the church in? Because after pastoring for 27 years, I've seen our church do this. Have high times, man, where you can't find a seat, and you have other times where you're wondering, hey, last one out, turn off the lights. Not literally, but you get it. It feels like that.
Yeah.
From a leader's perspective, And so what happens is people will jump on a bandwagon and say, oh no, 3 of my friends left, everybody's leaving, and God's not talked to them about leaving. Mm-hmm. God's called you to stay planted.
Right.
Now, I would totally agree with the idea of staying planted if at all possible, because once you uproot a tree, so I have a horticulturalist that attends our church, and she's always bringing me these amazing stories of trees and bushes and shrubs and flowers. But she says, once you uproot and you replant, it's almost impossible for that thing to produce for years, because it's getting acclimated to the soil. It's getting acclimated to, the different approach of the sun and the shade and the houses or the things around it. So if you have to exit, I would say the last thing you should do is look for the exit. But if you have to, I get that. I've been in that situation myself. So I was a part of an organization for 35 years and felt like it was time to make an exit. Because I had been with that organization so long, I had held state positions and national positions. I had consulted. I had preached quite a bit throughout the fellowship. So then I had to say, how am I going to do this without upsetting the fruit basket? So little by little, I just stopped having a voice. I still did what I was doing faithfully. And then when I had this time, I sat down with a friend of mine, and he said, you're in conflict with you. You're holding back on a decision you need to make. And I sat down and I just sent out a very simple email to my leader, just to my leader, not to all my friends, not to my neighbors, not to the people I liked or didn't like, just to my leaders, to say, thank you for the opportunity of serving, but our visions are no longer going in the same direction, and I feel it's best for me to step away. That was challenging. For 35 years, this was all I knew. Extremely challenging. But I had to wait for, number one, the timing of God. I had to wait till I was pure in my heart, not out of anger or being mad, but waiting and then doing it in a way that didn't upset the fruit basket. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And how you mentioned you went directly to your leader. That's another way to exit with grace, is, as we said earlier, you got your leader involved from an early stage. There is nothing more disconcerting to a pastor or a leader to hear that someone is discontent and considering leaving, or even have already made plans to leave, and to hear that from a third party, to hear from someone else. And so don't go around your leaders. Don't talk to all your friends first. My context is a multi-campus thing where our flow chart. So I lead our campus, but also have great senior pastors that are leading our church. And so it's easy sometimes for if a leader at our campus is feeling a transition, whether it's out of church or into a different campus or into a different ministry in the campus, to want to go around and go directly to the senior pastor. And what that does, just FYI for all of you guys, whenever you don't follow the hierarchy that's been established by leadership, it doesn't win you favors by the more senior leaders, because then they peg you as someone who doesn't understand structure and authority, and are probably less likely to see you ever in a different role. Like, it hurts you more than it helps you, and that's just a free piece of advice there. But the most important thing is who needs to know about this first. So if you're serving in a ministry, talk to your ministry leader, and say, look, I'm feeling this way, and then go directly to your pastor. But finding out who you're supposed to speak to when, and not letting your leader find out about it from a third party, or if there is a hurt feelings, if there's something that's, when we talk about the pull and the push, if there's something that's pushing you, to address that directly with them and not poison everyone around you. Because the last point I'll make is that with exiting with grace, you have to remember that your shift, your change, your exit will affect other people. And there are people that there's collateral damage that can be done, because you may be spiritually mature enough to hold a grudge against a leader and still have your soul okay with Jesus. But there's people that you're leading that have not yet reached that level of spiritual maturity. And so the poison that you spew on the way out can forever damage their relationship with the church, and even worse, maybe their relationship with the Lord. So remembering that how you leave will affect people around you, and not to poison the well before you go.
Yeah, let me add to that. I have a principle just in life. Okay, this has to do with anything. Okay, never talk to anyone about a situation that can't help you fix that situation. So in other words, if I'm at a restaurant, and everything goes wrong, it does me no good. And I'm very careful, because I think that waiting tables is one of the hardest jobs ever. It really is one of the hardest jobs ever. But I'm very careful not to beat up on the waitress about, something that came wrong, because she's just delivering food from the kitchen. I want to find the person who can actually do something about it. So I will ask to speak to the manager privately. Now, I do this so seldom. I don't remember the last time. What I do remember is that when I have exceptionally good service, I will ask to speak to the manager, and I will say, look, you got a great waitress here, or a great waiter here. I just wanted you to know that these people are great. I love giving positive reviews, because they usually get only the negatives. But when I have a problem, if I go to someone that on my level that can do nothing about it, all that does is frustrate me, and it frustrates them. And what it does is it creates confusion in the whole system. So if you're having a conflict with leadership, or if you're struggling and you're ready for an exit, don't talk to anyone who can't help you in the process. Right. Only go to the people, as you just said, ministry leader, pastor, whoever, whatever that hierarchy is, only go up. You never want to talk parallel or horizontal, and you never want to talk down. Right. You always want to take your concerns, your discussions, this kind of discussion up, because that's where you're going to get the best advice.
Wonderful. So if you have to exit, there is definitely a way to do it with grace, and that is to get the timing right, to be considerate. Don't poison the well on the way out. God honored David for submitting to a very terrible leader in Saul. God does that. And we're about to answer some questions, but I would also mention, there's this great story about whenever Miriam and Korah rebel against Moses, and their hands turn to leprosy. And so what that means is that everything they touch becomes destroyed. And whenever you leave the wrong way, whenever you get some bitterness in your spirit against leadership, literally everything you touch will be destroyed. And if you leave with bitterness in your heart, you'll carry that bitterness, that leprosy with you to the next season in the next place. And that infectious leprosy will then spread on, this, if I can be frank, if every church you've ever been to always has a problem, and every pastor you've ever served under always has a problem, and if every team you've ever been on has always been unhealthy, it very well could be you. And there could be a leprosy in your heart that you've not dealt with, and so now everything you touch becomes leprous. Okay, well, on that encouraging, uplifting, positive, let's answer some questions. We got a couple that have came in, and feel free to use your Q&A box here to ask us some more. Man, this has been fantastic tonight, Pastor Jonathan. So thank you for sharing this, and something that we don't talk about a lot, because who wants to talk about, like, hey, let's talk to you about how to exit the ministry you're in, or like, we're all about getting people into ministry, not out of ministry, but it really is a characteristic that distinguishes between people who will be a good leader and who won't be a good leader. If you don't figure this out,
yep,
God's not going to honor rebellion. God's not going to honor someone who tears down.
Mm-hmm.
And plus, that's a spiritual principle. Then a practical principle is that you will, if you don't exit the right way, it will catch up with you eventually, and you'll never earn the trust that you need to lead. So here's a good question, though. So if change is inevitable, so if it's to leave a ministry or to whatever, but if there's change and the Spirit's moving, the wind's blowing, why is it still so uncomfortable, even if it's what God is doing? Why don't we just have that peace that passes all understanding for the entire experience of change? If it's of God and it's inevitable, then why do we feel that discomfort?
So you started, Pastor Landon, we started this whole conversation talking about how uncomfortable people are with change. I mean, literally, you could change, of course, you and I have been around this long enough. We've probably seen people fuss about changing the flowers in front of the platform back in the day, or changing the color of carpet in the nursery. I mean, people are uncomfortable with change. And I think just coming to the understanding the same way others are uncomfortable with change, by nature, we are all uncomfortable with change. So this is why traffic patterns are so important. So when you're an entrepreneur, you want to get a position that is on people's normal traffic pattern, so that they don't have to change the traffic pattern to come to your store, to come to your coffee shop, to come to your church, to come to your whatever. Because once you force people to change a traffic pattern, it just becomes too difficult. As simple as it is to take a right instead of a left, I can't take the change. Right. And so by nature, we are people of routine. We are people that finds a comfortable place, and we have a tendency to stay there. And I think that just by nature, the Holy Ghost doesn't overrule the human nature all the time. So sometimes you have to say the Spirit is leading, and as uncomfortable as this is, I'm going with Jesus.
Right. And the spiritual maturity and I guess the walk of the Lord too, just your walk with God, to distinguish between those moments that are uncomfortable, because change is just always uncomfortable, mm-hmm. and when it really is a check, where there's like, this isn't just discomfort with change. God's trying to tell me that this isn't the right move for me. So there are times where that serious discomfort that you cannot, if you cannot get comfortable with a decision, you can't get peace about it. You just can't. The opportunity looks good, but it just never resonates with you. Then there is a chance that the Lord could be saying, look, that's an opportunity, not an assignment. Yeah. And so being able to differentiate between whenever you're just feeling uncomfortable, or whenever, the Lord's really trying to do something there too. God always, not always, but change is by nature uncomfortable. And so that will be something that you'll face. So how do you know when it's time to exit?
Are you asking me that question, or are you going to take off on that one? Because this is a tricky one.
Yeah, I mean, if you attend my church, never. So that's the cool.
There you go. It's just that easy.
For you, I would say there has to be a lot of things. That's such a hard question to answer, because everyone will hear what we say based on their own experiences, and we never want to justify a reason without knowing the specifics of the situation.
Yeah, exactly. The variables can be so different in every situation. So you can even have two people in the same church, but have multiple variables around each person. And one of them would be like, yes, this is right for you to exit. And the other would be like, no, the variables are totally different. You shouldn't exit. And many times I think we take our cues from the wrong things. We take our cues from other people. What are other people doing? We take our cues from what's that church doing that's better than what this church is doing. We take our cues from our feelings. I don't feel this church anymore. I don't feel like being here anymore. I didn't feel like going to school for 12 years, but my mom and dad made sure I had my school uniform on every day, and I went to school. So there's all of these things that we have to be careful of not to take cues from. I'm mad, they changed this, something didn't work out right, I didn't get that position. We have to be very careful of why we should not leave. And I think once we determine that filter of why we should not leave, then that enables us to better assess why we should leave.
Right. So good.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And another metric I would use is I would say, can you do anything to make that situation better? If so, do it. So like if there's a problem, if you feel like that the church you're in, you want to leave because of this problem, could you make that problem better? Mm-hmm. I don't want to go to, I've heard this one. I love this. It's like, I don't like that church, or I quit going to church because the people weren't friendly. Yeah. Well, that's like, friendly is a two-way street, man. Like, very few people that if you're friendly to them will still not be friendly to you. So if the church wasn't friendly, there was a lot you could have done to cancel that out. So what can you do to make it better? But also, I think good spiritual advice from maybe a disinterested party. Like if you're having a problem with your church, building relationships with other pastors, seasoned leaders outside that can let you know. There's been times where I've done that with Dr. Rassfield, or where I have people up in my upline where I go, okay, look, here's how I'm feeling, and sometimes the answer is, okay, no, you're just being too sensitive. And then sometimes the answer is like, okay, well, maybe God is. Mm-hmm. But without knowing the specifics, that's a tough thing. But those are some good thing. Some good guidelines. Man, the question, I think we hit a nerve, Pastor. This is lots of questions that are coming in now. Whenever you're in a season where several people are leaving a church, and we've all been there before, where there's a kind of a wave of people exiting. How do you handle? This is a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. Whoever asked it. How do you handle those friendships? So I'm bought into my church. I'm all in. I love my church. A bunch of my friends are leaving. People that I've done life with, that I grew up together. This is personal for me because as a pastor's kid, you know what this feels like. Like the church family, like we say, like that's actually our family. Yeah. And then they get upset and they leave, and it's like, oh, well, that's my family that I'll just never see again. How cool is that? So how do you handle those friendships?
So I have been a part of, I have seen, let me approach it from this way. I have seen those who had the unspoken rule, the church had the unspoken rule that anybody that leaves this church, they're off limits. that friendship is over and done yesterday. Now, I think that's obviously, I think that's an unhealthy approach. I've also seen where it's like, okay, we just maintain the friendship at the same level, nothing changes. I think that's unhealthy because it can feed the wrong things. Now, that sounds a little bit like, ugh. Here's what I would say is if you are staying put, or if you're the one exiting, and there's friends on other side of the scenario, that you just make in your own heart, you wouldn't even have to state this publicly, but you just make a determination in your heart, we will not talk about church stuff. We'll talk about puppy dogs, we'll talk about dinner, we'll go to the ball game together, but we will not talk about church stuff, because it can make a small sore fester. Now, does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So you have to create rules in your own spirit to keep your heart right. Yeah. To say, I like these people. I'm not sure why they left, or I know why they left, but I like these people. So here's what we'll do. We'll take this whole piece off the board. So we just won't talk about that. We're not going to talk about church. I'm not talking about how awesome your new pastor is and how bad your old pastor is, because that's still my pastor. We're not going to talk about, how good or bad this church is doing or that church is doing or what. No, we're going to talk about ball. We're going to talk about the knitting club. We're going to talk about the book club. We're going to go, have a picnic together, but we're going to call this off limits to preserve both of our spirits from being embittered or confused.
Yeah. And I would, one further point, that's great advice, just to, not bring it up in conversation. I would take it one step further and I would say, okay, I'm serving at my church because my life is invested here. Like I'm where I love to be. So if you are intentionally doing things to damage the church,
yes,
you are choosing to limit our friendship. Now, if you can leave well and transition well, and you're not going around town saying terrible things or sending petty messages on Facebook or but if you choose to have a aggressive stance towards where I'm serving, then I'm not choosing to cut you off as a friend. You are, because you're choosing to attack something that's very valuable to me. Mm-hmm. And as difficult as that is, that's a reality. So I do think with those friendships, you have to be very careful. And the last thing I would add about that is clarity and communication with your leaders are important there, because if there's been a group of people that have left your church and that's still your social group, and it's known that you're hanging out with them, that's always going to be on your pastor's mind or on your leader's mind of like, well, I wonder where they stand. So you need to communicate very clearly where you stand with your pastor. Like, hey, our kids are still, our kids grew up together. They're still friends. We still like them, but I want you to know I'm loyal. I love our church. I'm on your side. I'm with you here. So communicating that as well.
Two very, very good points. I just want to jump on board with that and shout a huge amen. And I was coming from the stance of they had made a healthy exit. Right. If there's an unhealthy exit, that changes the ball game, and you addressed that beautifully, and I appreciate that.
Right. Absolutely. So let's maybe do one more question here. I think because this is a good one. Does assignment / opportunity, open doors, does that come before or after you fill a pool? So I think the question is like, okay, I feel like God's doing something. Do I wait for the door to open, or do I go ahead and make the transition? And whenever I make the transition, the door will open as a result of that. And I've seen it work both ways in my life, just kind of spoiler alert, but you can go ahead.
Yeah. I agree. But here's what I would say is when you're first in ministry, don't be afraid to jump after every opportunity that comes to you. Because Jesus says, if you're faithful in the small things, I'll make you ruler over many.
Right.
And many times we're so focused on getting the many things that we're not going to do any of the small things.
Yeah.
So we just sit here and say, well, I'm waiting for, a church to open, a 300 member church to open up for me to go pastor. And it's like, why don't you lead the youth class of 12? I literally had a guy that was on staff here, and he was like, I am going, well, I need to be careful. He might not, it's been years ago, but he's like, I'm going to this city, and God's going to give me a church of like, he had this astronomical number. I won't throw out there to protect his craziness, but he had this whole crazy idea. And I'm like, look, I'm just asking you to do a small job here. So at some point you have to learn how to be faithful in the small. So I think early on, it's not bad to go after opportunities to practice leadership, to practice ministry, for lack of a better term. It's probably not the best term, but you get what I'm saying. To practice. And then as you get deeper into ministry, you will leave the opportunities behind and start to hone in on an assignment.
Right. So good. Yeah. I think that's a great insight. I remember my dad trusted me with a class that was basically a Sunday school class, probably 20, 30 adults. And what's funny is because I took that opportunity so seriously and I said yes and I did it. A lot of the sermons that I preach today, that I've actually preached to thousands of people where God's given me a stage to preach to thousands of people at one time, were written for 20 or 30 people originally. Because I said yes to an assignment. Yeah. I said yes to an opportunity. I said yes to what God was doing. And then, look what God was able to do with that. So I think that's a great point that you feel like, that you just keep doing what you do until it makes room for you. And then there are times where a step of faith is required, where you just know that the season's changing, and you know that, I don't know your situation whenever you started the church, but usually when people start churches or take churches, it's rarely like a can't fail opportunity. There's rarely a lot of assurances, and this is going to be the easiest, greatest thing ever. But so there is this thing where you take a step of faith, and that step of faith, like the children of Israel, they stepped into the Jordan and then it parted, where I would have said, Lord, you part the Jordan, then I step. And he said, no, you step, then I part.
Yeah.
Which is the way the Lord works sometimes. Well, great.
Let me just wrap up one thought here with this whole assignment and opportunity thing. I just felt the Spirit just speak to me pretty strong on this. Is that, think about it like this, is that Paul early on was going anywhere and everywhere he could go. Just get me in front of two people and I'm going to talk about the gospel of Jesus Christ. But then it comes to later on in life where he says, I wanted to go to Bithynia, but the Spirit wouldn't let me.
Right.
And I want to go to Asia, but the Spirit wouldn't let me. And so what will happen is look around for any opportunity to serve. If it's picking up trash, if it's, driving your pastor to somewhere to an important meeting where he needs to think, or if it's, serving in children's ministry or whatever it is, just put yourself into every opportunity you can serve, because if you'll do that faithfully, God will put you in a place to where you won't go just anywhere, you'll go somewhere.
So good.
So do anything so that you can do something.
Wow.
Go anywhere. So, I don't mean like leave your church, but go anywhere within your church to serve so that you can go somewhere.
So good.
And see that happen, like where that opportunity flows into assignment. So I'll jump off that. But this is one of my favorite topics right here, because I've wrestled with this personally. And I feel like, the power of assignment is amazing.
Wow. That was worth the price of admission right there. Do anything so that you can do something.
Yeah.
And Matt, particularly for younger leaders, that's such I've said often that I'm probably at 34 and I've been doing this for a while. I'm probably just now reaching a stage where I've had to say no.
Mm.
I would just say yes to anything.
Mm-hmm.
Want me to do it, then yes, I'll do it. And oh, I'm gonna get in trouble here, but anyway, we listen to like leadership podcasts. This is just a good word for some young leaders, of these leaders who are operating at this crazy level. And so they'll say things like, you got to learn to say no, and you got to learn to only do what you're passionate about, and don't waste your energy on things that don't feed your soul. And no, if you want to start, like you're not Craig Rochelle, so you say yes. You haven't reached that point in life yet where you get the luxury of saying no to a bunch of things. Like, until you've arrived to your assignment, just say yes to everything, and that's going to open the doors for you. We go all day about that, because you have experiences and I have experience with people who have asked you to take them somewhere in leadership, but then they don't say yes to the things you would like for them to do. Mm-hmm. And it makes it really difficult for them. But this was just so good, Pastor Jonathan. Thank you for that. Like, that's just been an amazing night. So I appreciate you and all that you've done for us, and for imparting the wisdom that you have. And I know you've helped a lot of people. So thank you.
Well, it's been an honor, and I'm so glad I was able to be here tonight.
Absolutely. And students, thank you for logging on. Grant, thank you for doing a good job. I'm sorry that I've talked so much that I left no space for all your wisdom. Next time, okay? But students, thank you for attending, and for the fact that we went 11 minutes over. So just thank you for that. We will see you next time. You guys have a great evening, and be blessed.